Today we're going to celebrate communion as we do twice every month. And I want to tell you a little secret. When I was pretty new to this whole Christianity thing, there was a time when I would show up to church and I would find a seat in one of the pews and I would open my bulletin and look at it, and when I saw the word communion, I thought, oh shoot. And I quietly got up and escaped out of the side door, hoping that no one would notice. I know that might seem quite rude, but to tell you the truth, communion made no sense to me. You know, it was this silly little play or silly little ritual. And I felt like a phony pretending that I was having some kind of spiritual experience when I wasn't. And I imagine that there were other people in that sanctuary who felt the same way. And I also imagine that maybe you, at a time or two, feel the same way. We're putting on some kind of play. You know, I'll tell you that even now, as I preside over the sacred elements, and as I, break the bread and bless the bread, break the bread, and share the bread, I sometimes feel like I am playing a role in a play, a role kind of to be performed. And, that's just the honest truth. Sometimes it touches me and sometimes it doesn't. But my hope is that together we might explore the mystery of this bread and of this wine. And we might explore the idea of how is it supposed to be transformational in our lives. Karl Rahner, who is a contemporary theologian, spoke of communion this way. I love this. He said, "Some things are understood not by grasping, but by allowing oneself to be grasped." Don't you like that? Some things are understood not by grasping, but by allowing oneself to be grasped. I pray that as we all take communion twice a month, that we will all come to a place where we allow ourselves, where we let go of the idea of understanding communion, and we allow ourselves simply to be grasped by the Spirit and the holiness of God at the table. Churches and denominations, they celebrate communion in all sorts of different ways, the Lord's Supper, Eucharist, whatever you want to call it. And some churches, like the Lutheran Church practices communion every single Sunday. And the Catholic Church offers communion every single day. And some non-denominational churches offer it every now and then, and sometimes not at all. And so not only is the frequency of how often we do communion something to look at, but also how we practice communion. So it can be a very formal liturgy with robes and candles and bells. We call that smells and bells, a more traditional way of experiencing communion. And then we have all the way, everything in between, to that kind of free-for-all artistic expression of our faith. So not only is the frequency different in the denomination and the practice different in the denomination, there's also plenty of theologies, plenty of interpretations of what communion is all about. What is the It's a good question to ask yourself. For you, what's the point of communion? So here's my direct answer to that question. I would say that the point is that we are all hungry and we are all thirsty and we all need to eat and drink, otherwise we will die. Another way to say that is to be human is to be hungry. Not to be hungry is to be dead. Think about that not only in the physical way, but the spiritual way. You know, in Western culture, for the vast majority of us, we have forgotten about hunger. Meal times are simply a time to refuel, and we all have meal times every day. And for most of us, our bodies are satisfied continuously, and we may easily forget that hunger even exists at all. You know, that might be a little sad. Because when we think about the spiritual discipline of fasting, what's fasting about? Fasting is a reminder that humans are hungry. Hungry for food and hungry for God's love. We're thirsty and our mouths are dry and we long to be refreshed with water and with God's grace. Physical hunger is a painful experience and thirst is debilitating. They are both experiences that humans have, and they are both experiences of urgent need, but so too is spiritual hunger and spiritual thirst. It's also a painful experience to not feel and know God in your life. And it's an experience of urgent need. So, you know, food, feasts, banquets, breads, manna, living waters, vines, figs, weddings, all of that stuff is constantly referenced in our biblical scripture, both the Hebrew text and the New Testament. So why? Why in scriptures are the stories of God and the stories of humans lift up the concept of being hungry and being thirsty? For sure, there were plenty of hungry people in Jesus' times and before Jesus' times and after Jesus' times. And looking at this as a literal exercise is all about social justice. But looking at this from a spiritual perspective is personal piety. And that's what John Wesley was all about, the two together, social justice, personal piety. And time again in Scripture, the men and the women and the children in these biblical stories, they're hungry and they're thirsty time and time again, and always God provides. The Scripture refers to our physical hunger, but perhaps more importantly, I'm not sure about that, our spiritual hunger as well. So why did God create us with this insatiable appetite? You know, what is the purpose of being created with this hunger and this thirst? You know, wouldn't the world be just so much better if hunger and thirst were simply not a part of the human experience? I mean, wouldn't that be nice? We wouldn't have to worry about people starving and dying on the other side of the world or right here in Battleground. We very rarely consider these automatic human needs and behaviors like eating, like sleeping, like breathing. So we just do these things. We don't even consider them. Now there's this, I'd like to tell you a story of a young student who went to his spiritual teacher and he asked the question, "Master, how can I truly find God?" And so the teacher asked the student to accompany him to the river. And when they got to the river, the teacher asked him to go into the middle of the stream, middle of the river. And when they got to the middle of the river, the teacher said, "Please immerse yourself in the water." So the student did as he was instructed, whereupon the teacher put his hands on the young man's head and held him underwater. And so soon the student was struggling. He began to struggle, and the master held him under the water still. And a moment had passed, and the student was thrashing and beating the water and air with his arms, and still the master held him under the water. And finally, the student was released, and he shot up, and he took a deep breath, gasping for air. And the teacher waited a minute for him to catch his breath, settle down, and he said to the student, "When you desire God as truly as you desired to breathe the air you just breathed, then you shall find God." Perhaps just like our need for air, our hunger and our thirst are meant to draw us closer to God. And so whether we're aware of this or not, whether we recognize our yearning for God or perhaps we're oblivious to it, the truth is that hunger is a reality that each and every one of us experience, physical hunger and spiritual hunger. And so the story of feeding the 5,000 hungry men and a few more women and children with just a few loaves of bread and a couple of smelly fish, that foreshadows the Lord's Supper. And I'll tell you why. Because in this story, this feeding of the 5,000 is told in all four Gospels. And in each of the stories, Jesus takes the bread and he blesses it. And then he breaks it. And then he shares it. He does it in feeding the 5,000, and he does it at the Last Supper with his friends, and he does it at that table right there with you and I twice a month. Take, bless, break, share. So let's think about why this eating and this drinking are so prevalent in our scriptures. Here's what I think. I think it is because, whether we know it or not, physical and spiritual hunger is a human experience. And our physical hunger is going to draw us to Safeway. But our spiritual hunger is going to draw us to church or any other place where one might center themselves into God's presence. So no matter what your interpretation of communion might be, as I said, there are just a plethora of them. What is the purpose? And I would venture to say, no matter what interpretation you're looking at, the purpose of the sacrament is the same. And that is, as bread and water keep our body physically alive, Christ's body and grace, served at this table, is meant to satisfy our deepest longing, our hunger for some kind of higher power to be present in our lives. This is the kind of hunger that draws God into our lives, that draws us to the table where we can eat and where we can drink and we can be filled with the only thing that will satisfy us. And that is the absolute love of God. We'll enjoy communion together in just a few moments.